It is my honor to be here with you tonight, and what I would really like to do is maybe stray from my remarks a little bit, just to give you an idea that, as Dale noted, this is the 37th Annual Freedom Seminar, and I have the privilege of having been at all 37 of them and actually played a role in just about every one of them since inception. And if you think about it, the full original title, and we still use it to some degree, is Freedom in 4th Century America now. The original was Freedom in 3rd Century America, because the fact is, if you think about it, the United States was founded in the 1700s, so if you look at the 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, and now the 21st century, the United States has been around through 4 different centuries. It's not quite 250 years old, but it is a country that has, in many ways, shaped dramatically the global economy and the world as we know today. And when you think about the United States and you analyze its history, it is certainly a country that is not perfect. It was founded on wonderful ideas, but we didn't get those ideas right at inception. Certainly slavery was wrong. Certainly women not being able to vote was wrong. And yet, over time, we built or put in place a political and an economic system that was really, in many ways, organic from inception. Meaning we had a set of rules or a set of laws, and we took a look at those rules and those laws, and then we said, in the future, things are going to be different, and we're going to look at things a bit differently. But if we have the right foundations, this organic document called the U.S. Constitution can grow and change and yet uphold the original principles while being part of and a relevant part of a changing and dynamic U.S. and global economy. So, the fact that we were able to abolish slavery, the fact that women's rights and voting rights came about, as I noted, not as soon as they should have, and should have been the case from inception. But it speaks to the fact that the United States, whether you know it or not, is the longest and oldest consistent form of government in the world today. And you say, oh, that can't be true. Look at all these European countries that go back long before 1776, or China or Japan. They have histories going back thousands of years. But the point is, when you think about the oldest consistent form of government, it is freedom. If you think about, the Communist Revolution, where Mao Zedong took over in China in the late 1940s, you think about the collapse of the British royalty and the monarchy coming to an end in terms of having legitimate ruling power. That took place in the 1800s. The French Revolution took place after the American Revolution. In your lifetime, you've seen a couple revolutions in what used to be the Soviet Union, which is today Russia. So it's interesting to note that the United States is the oldest consistent form of government, and certainly a free government, in the world today at just under 250 years. So we have been conducting the Freedom Seminar for closing in on 40 years to take a look at this subject, to talk about this subject, to analyze this subject. And as it relates to where we are today, Morris was going to give you a bigger picture. He was going to talk a lot about his experiences. And he held 2 ministerial positions in New Zealand. He was the Minister of Commerce. He had labor under his auspices. And he was the Vice Minister of a couple of other departments within the government of New Zealand. Now, he was a very content, very successful sheep rancher in New Zealand, and just found that his country was, as he noted, going to hell in a handbasket. Economically, it was doing extremely poorly, and he decided to run for Parliament. So he became a member of Parliament. And when he became a member of Parliament, when he was elected, over 75% of the entire New Zealand population was unionized. The entire working population, over 75% was unionized. And it was with that background that he and some others worked very hard to make the minority political party the majority political party within the Parliament. And literally, the Wall Street Journal refers to it as the New Zealand miracle. And remember when I showed you the Heritage Foundation Wall Street Journal Freedom Index? Because for the first 4 years that the Wall Street Journal and the Heritage Foundation measured economic freedom in a country, New Zealand was not even in the top 60. Today they sit at number 3, and a lot of it had to do with the work of Morris McTeigue and his colleagues, who took an economy that is a rather formidable economy and dramatically reformed its economy. And I'll mention maybe toward the end of my talk some of the things that they did in New Zealand and some things that are happening that are showing bright spots here in the United States and elsewhere. But the other thing that Morris did was he became the ambassador to Canada from New Zealand for 10 years after he retired from his ministerial position. And the interesting part of it is that our neighbors to the north, our strongest allies, our best friends in terms of the international economy, the Canadian economy has gone through a tremendous metamorphosis if you haven't been paying close attention in the last 15 years. And Morris had a little something to do with that. He actually buys the Canadian government. And if you look at it, Canada is one of the G7 countries, meaning it's one of the great 7, now we call it the G8. But Canada is interesting in the fact that Canada has cut its taxes, especially on business, and has balanced its federal budget 5 years in a row. And we find it impossible to balance our budget here in the United States, yet our friends in Canada have done it 5, getting ready to do it at least 6 years in a row. And so the real question that we have to ask is, can capitalism and the American dream survive? And the answer is yes, it can. But I think what's important as you look at this slide, by the way, any of these, don't worry about taking copious notes because I'll make sure you have these slides available to you if you desire. Just come on up and ask me, or I'll make sure that Dr. Matchek has them. But I think that one of the real interesting premises that we have to look at, one of the fundamental points of reference is, why has the United States been so successful? Why has it gone from being a dream to the greatest economy in the history of the world in a relatively short period of time? By historical standards, it certainly has achieved greatness in a very short period of time, 200 years, in terms of the existence of geologic or geographic country is a drop in the bucket of time. But yet the United States was probably the most formidable economy in the world within 120 to 130 years of its existence. And certainly the U.S. has been blessed with natural resources. It has been blessed with strong geography, topography. But many countries around the world are blessed in that regard. The United States has become the greatest economy in the history of the world, in my opinion, because of its high level of economic freedom and its endorsement of and support of business and entrepreneurship. And here I'm not talking about crony capitalism. I'm not talking about supporting a business with political favors just to protect that business against other businesses. I'm talking about creating a marketplace where the center of the economy is the customer. That businesses are only successful if the women and men that run those businesses do it well and create things that customers want. And so here, when you look at it, this is the wellspring of human progress. The wellspring of the American dream is the entrepreneur. are those women and men that go out there and risk their fortunes to start a business, to bring that business to fruition, and to create value for the consumers freely buying the products. And the thing that I think is important for you to understand, and if you're taking notes, make note of this because it's not on the slide. But one of the things that you should understand is that if I asked you, if I said, how many of you know how many companies were in the original Dow Jones Industrial Average when Dr. Dow coined it in 1890? Anybody want to take a guess? You don't have to raise your hand.
8.
How many?
8.
No. Same number today.
3.
Add a 0. 30. Very good. All right, there were 30 companies in the Dow Jones Industrial Average. Now, you played around with some lower numbers and some higher numbers, but the final number was 30. How many of those do you think are still in the Dow Jones Industrial Average today? How many of the original 30? 4. Anybody else? 7. 4 plus 7 is what? Divided by 11. 1. Very good. All right, so there was one company. Anybody want to guess who that company was? And is? They light up a lot of things. Very good. Generally electric, correct. And if I said to you, let's look at the Fortune 100 companies, the 100 largest companies in the United States in 1900. How many of those 100 companies do you think are in the Fortune 100 today? 0. Anybody else? 1. Which one is it? GE. But the interesting part of it is, we had, it was either 8 or 9 train railroad companies, 2 train manufacturing companies. The Ohio Matchbook Company was one of the 100 largest companies in America. You know, we don't even give matchbooks out at weddings anymore. You know, matchbooks, matchboxes, you know, we have them every now and then, but it's a minuscule part of the market. Why? Yeah, newer technology like lighters and the e-cigarettes. There you go. I was even thinking of that. Write that one down. But the point with it is the marketplace replaces things that become obsolete. And you're constantly under competition from your competitors to do something different, to do something better, to create something that human beings want that they may not even know that they want. And so when you think about it, it's that entrepreneur, it's that woman, it's that man that sees something that rarely anybody else sees. And they figure out a way to harness the resources, to bring it to fruition, and to deliver it in the marketplace. And that's a rare individual, the entrepreneur. Those women and men see things that most of us don't see. And then when they come up with the invention, they've also got to successfully commercialize it and bring it to the market. So those individuals are rare, but they dramatically change the world. And so under a free market system, under capitalism, we argue that it's moral and it's ethical for those individuals to be paid an unusually high and abnormally high profit. We call it entrepreneurial profit. These people become wealthy because they're doing something extraordinarily exceptional for individuals and for society in general. Nobody forces you to buy their products, but they do things that are exceptional. Now, there have been a lot of countries that have said, well, we think entrepreneurs are important, but we don't believe that they should be rewarded or awarded, depending on how you look at it, the way that a free market capitalist system argues them to be. And so, when you look at it, why did communism fail? Why did the Soviet Union collapse? Why is Cuba living in abject poverty? Why has China slowly but methodically moved from communism to capitalism? I was in China in the 1980s, and it was interesting. There were millions of bikes on the road, and my colleague and I, drove down the main throughways through Beijing and Shanghai, and we didn't see a car for miles. If you go there today, it's just the opposite. You rarely see a bicycle, and you see automobiles all over the place. And in fact, China is now the world's largest producer of automobiles. The U.S. is still the largest single country market. But China has changed dramatically because they've moved toward a market system. And one of the things that you'll see in some later slides is that in China, you know that the top corporate income tax rate is about 15 points lower than ours? Here's this country that still says it's a communist country, yet their top tax on business is 25% and ours is 40%. Might that be a reason why we're not competing as well as we can, or we should? Second slide here, this you should have had Dr. Matchek's or Dr. Takarov's or Dr. Harris's classes in macro or microeconomics, and you should have looked at this thing we call the circular flow. And we argue that there are three main areas within an economy. Three main sources of jobs, providers of resources, users of resources, etc. And so it's government, households, and business. And when you look at these, the thing that's important to understand is that there's a focus that is dramatically different today in this country than there was 100 years ago. Now, you'll hear from my good friend and colleague Richard Ebeling tomorrow, and some of you remember Dr. Ebeling on our faculty last year. And Dr. Ebeling and I wrote a longer piece called Can Capitalism and the American Dream Survive? And one of the slides that we put in there was a slide that showed what government consumed of our economy in 1900. And if you look at local, state, and federal taxes combined, government consumed about 7.8% of GDP in 1900. Today, government consumes just under 40%. Now, some people would argue maybe 7.8% was too low. At 7.8%, local, state, and federal government, a consumption of GDP in the form of largely taxes was too low. Dr. Ebeling thought it was way too high. I thought those were the good old days. But I think all of us can agree today that government consuming about 40% of GDP is too high. And when you look at a number of countries that we compete against, we talked about the United States being the home of freedom, economic and political freedom. One of the real questions is, can we continue to be the engine of democracy, the great republic, the protector of freedom and free enterprise around the world, if government is consuming 40% of GDP? And, quite frankly, should we be doing a lot of these things? You know, what should the role of government be? You're going to hear Herman Kirchner talk on Saturday night. He is one of the foremost international policy experts in the world today. You know, what is the role of 14. And what this means is that relative to the rest of the world, we have higher taxes, higher regulations, more government, and we have less economic freedom. And that's what this index is trying to measure. Now, one of the reasons I believe, now our president, Dr. Pretty, and I, we write an annual forecast for the Midland Daily News that a lot of the Hearst newspapers and magazines pick up nationwide. And we have been unfortunately pretty accurate the last couple of years, the last 3 years, in predicting that the U.S. economy is not growing the way that it should. Here's another note for you, but if you look at the U.S. economy on average, the U.S. economy since World War II till the end of 2014 has grown at an average annual rate of about 3.27%. And in the last 5-6 years, it's grown at an average rate of just under 2%. It's the worst economic recovery in terms of GDP growth since the Great Depression, since the end of World War II. And the question is, why are we not growing? Our current president would say it's George Bush's fault. I'd say 6 years later, it's probably time to stop blaming George Bush. Did I have some issues with President Bush? Yes. Do I have some issues with President Obama? Yes. But the real question is, you folks are 19, 20, 21, maybe a few of you a little older, a little younger. But the interesting part of it is, it's now your economy. And you're going to see, we as your parents and grandparents, aunts and uncles, we haven't done a good job. We haven't been good stewards. But it doesn't mean that the reason why the economy is not successful has anything to do with the failure of capitalism. I would suggest to you that our biggest failure and the greatest problem that the United States has today, gang, is that we have this insatiable appetite as politicians to get reelected. We have a really hard time saying no. And so if you look at this chart shows you that from 1776, when the United States became a free and independent country, to 1982, we ran up a total national debt over that period of $1 trillion. And from 1982 to date, we haven't messed around. So in 33 years, 32 years actually, we've taken the national debt from $1 trillion to almost $18.2 trillion. So we've run up roughly $17.2 trillion in national debt since 1982. That's wrong. It's highly irresponsible. We can make up every excuse under the sun, and it's bipartisan. If you're a Democrat, you blame the Republicans. If you're a Republican, you blame the Democrats. And quite frankly, I say a pox on both their houses. The fact of the matter is, we have been highly irresponsible. You have to balance your checkbooks. You have to balance your household budgets, your family budgets. Why shouldn't the government have to do it? 49 out of 50 states have a balanced budget amendment where they balance their state budget every year. And I would say this, we've heard for decades from politicians pointing the finger at the other side of the aisle. I say enough's enough. If capitalism and the American dream is going to survive, we have to get our debt under control. And if we don't, we are going to have a fiscal crisis of biblical proportions, or a fiscal crisis at least as bad as what caused the collapse of the German economy and the bringing to power of a tyrant like Adolf Hitler when the Weimar Republic collapsed from debt between World War I and World War II. And by the way, they were the third largest economy in the world when that happened. So we have to get our handle on our deficit. We have to look at the fact that right now, for every man, woman, and child, the national debt, for every baby being born and somebody who's ready to breathe their last breath, is about $55,000 to $56,000 per person. A household of four, your debt's about $220,000. It's ridiculous. And it's something that people should not have to face. But it is. And here's another one that at least should be of concern to you, and that is as you look at the funding of the national debt here. This chart, because the fiscal data wasn't in yet, I included where it was in 2014 and what it was in 2013, and then what it ended up being in 2013 probably ended up being a few billion short of that in 2014. But here's the general point. Right now, our government borrows a lot of money on that $18.2 trillion. So it's a debt, so we have to finance it. So we finance it by borrowing. One of the reasons why our Federal Reserve is trying to keep interest rates excessively low, for those of you in econ or finance, one of the main reasons is financing of the national debt. You know, we had a program in which we were to cut $1 trillion over 10 years. What do we call that program? Dr. Matchuk? We were into an austerity program where we said we were going to cut $1 trillion over 10 years, or $100 billion a year. And the federal government is saying, this is impossible. We can't do that. This is ridiculous. We've cut everything that we can cut. Not true. But here's the interesting point. Right now, interest rates, that blended interest rate on the national debt, averages just under 2%. If we have inflation, if inflation picks up, what do you think will happen to interest rates? Will they go up or down? Okay, they'll go up. What happens if we have a real economic recovery where the economy is growing year after year at 4.5%? As the economy grows, there'll be greater demand for money. What will happen to interest rates? They'll go up. So will the federal government have to pay more on interest rates? Yes. So right now we're paying just under 2%. What would happen if we were paying 3% or 4%? The gross interest on the national debt last year was about $415 billion. But because some of it we were paying to each other, we said, well, we owe each other, so we don't count it. It's improper bookkeeping, in my opinion. But the point is, our net national debt cost was $220 billion last year. And remember, the federal government's fiscal year ends in September. So if interest rates double, what does that rate go to on the federal budget? That goes to $440 billion. If we paid $220 last year, and it goes to $440, we're saying we can't cut $100 billion, we would just add $220 billion. If we got up again to average long-term interest rates, the net interest on the national debt would be between $450 and $500 billion, almost $500 billion. If it were $500 billion, you realize that would be the entire GDP of the 27th largest economy in the world. But that's where we are right now with interest on the national debt. Can we afford it now? Yes. But the solution that we hear all the time coming out of Washington is we are going to tax business. Business doesn't pay its fair share. By whose measurement? You know, if you look at this, take a look at this chart. Spend a little time looking at that chart. Top tax rate, as I said to you before, in China is between 24 and 25% on business. Top tax rate in India, another quote-unquote former communist country, is 30%. Top tax rate, as much as you may not like Putin, you might not like a lot of his policies, the top tax rate on business in Russia is 16%. And by the way, the top tax rate in Ireland, if you celebrated St. Patrick's Day, was 13%. Or is 13%. And our rate, if you look at federal tax rate of 35%, the average of our 50 states gives us a blended tax rate according to KPMG one of the world's largest accounting firms. Some of you will go to work for them. A lot of our graduates already do. KPMG says that we have the highest tax rate on business in the industrialized world. We're higher than Japan, we're higher than Germany, we're higher than China, we're higher than England, France, etc. And if you look at it and think about it, when you analyze where we are, the other factor that you have to take a look at, gang, is we're one of only 4 countries in the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Those are the 30 fastest growing economies, largest by per capita GDP in the world. There's only 4 countries in there that are worldwide tax systems, and the U.S. is by far and away the largest. So let me give you a simple example here. If you happen to be the CEO, your name happen to be Andrew Liveris, and you're the president and CEO of Dow Chemical, and you happen to be competing against the president and CEO of Bayer, which is a giant German chemical company. Germany is part of a territorial tax system, while the U.S. is a worldwide tax system. So you hear all the time about American companies don't pay their fair share, and that American companies use tax loopholes and keep money overseas. Here's a real hard, cold fact that you ought to bring up with your politician friend, Democrat or Republican, when the issue comes up. If your buyer, B-A-Y-E-R, yes, they make Bayer aspirin, and you earn $1 million profit at your operation in Ireland, okay? You earn $1 million profit at your operation in Ireland. You pay taxes of how much? 13%. So how much do you bring back to Germany? You earn $1 million, you pay 13%? How much? You earn $1 million? 870,000. Thank you. You bring back 870,000. Do you pay any more taxes to the German government? Yes or no? No. The answer is no. Because you are part of a territorial system, which most of our global competitors tax their companies on a territorial system basis. Or, let's say that you are Dow Chemical, and you bring your money back to the United States. You pay how much in taxes in Ireland? 13. You bring how much back? 870,000. You get a tax credit on the 13%. Then you pay 6% Michigan tax, 35% federal income tax, and you pay an effective tax rate of over 40% on that money overseas. So what do you probably tend not to do as much if you're an American company with income you've earned overseas? You don't bring it home. And we sit here and we blame and we criticize these companies when they're just trying to compete in a global economy. Where, by the way, gang, Dow Chemical brings home a big chunk of its profits, and it does over 55% of its business globally. Midland would not be as large and as strong and have the employment base that it has if Dow were not a global multinational corporation. So the time for us to talk openly and honestly about the uncompetitive nature of our tax system is here. Dave Camp, who stepped down as the congressman from Midland, he was the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, a great human being, a great American. He tried to bring about tax reform, and unfortunately he was blocked by both the Democrats and his own Republican Party. We have to do things that make sense, but we've got to have an open dialogue, an open discussion, an open discord about what it takes for American companies to compete in a free and global economy. And I would submit to you that we're not doing that, or we're not doing it well. Some good news. Oil. Natural gas. The United States is becoming energy independent. Unfortunately, it is not due to any policy in Washington right now. It is largely due to hydraulic fracking on private land and state land. Actually, drilling on federal land in the last 6 years has gone down. Yet today, you see, tremendous entrepreneurial innovation. You see incredible technology where these entrepreneurs are going after resources in ways that people had not dreamed of before. Contrary to popular belief, hydraulic fracturing is extremely safe. There have been very few incidents of problems. And with any technology, as human progress takes place, you're going to have some problems, you're going to have some accidents, but hydraulic fracturing has proven to be incredibly successful. And for those of you that reside in Michigan, there are a lot of geological studies that say Michigan could actually be the epicenter for hydraulic fracturing in the future. And it's going to take a lot of debate, and it should happen. It's going to take a lot of convincing, and those debates and convincing must take place. But there's a lot of analysis that says below the state of Michigan, below the Great Lakes, is more natural gas and oil than in Saudi Arabia and two other Middle Eastern countries combined. Whether you know it or not, in the 1930s, the first World Oil Congress was held about 25 miles west of here in Mount Pleasant, Michigan. Mount Pleasant, mid-Michigan, never went through a Great Depression. Michigan was the third largest natural gas producing state and the fourth largest oil producing state in the 1930s. And a lot of the decline in that area had to do with regulations and the fact that we didn't have technology to safely get the oil and the natural gas at certain levels or deeper, or to get it if it was embedded within rock. So it's interesting what those entrepreneurs and what technology allows us to bring to fruition. Now, do I believe that capitalism and the American dream can survive? The answer is absolutely yes. I believe that. But I will say to you that there's a lot of debate around this particular topic. And a lot of my reason for optimism doesn't come out of what's happening in Washington. A lot of the reason for my optimism comes from the fact that you see a state like Michigan. And Michigan, gang, for a long, long time is an economic basket case. And Michigan has made dramatic changes, especially in the last 4+ years under Governor Snyder. And what I'm here to tell you is that what has happened in Michigan has simply been nothing but a minor economic miracle. We have dramatically cut and simplified taxes. We have dramatically cut regulations. We, in 2012, became the 25th right-to-work state in the country. And I say that to you as the person that led the research team with people from Northwood, from Notre Dame, from Central Michigan, from Rutgers University, from the Citadel. And we put together a rather definitive report that the governor and both sides of the aisle looked at very closely, which pointed out that Michigan was, in fact, one of the worst performing states in the country over the previous 10 years. And it was only as we looked at the hard, cold data that Michigan was able to openly say, we need tax reform. We need regulatory reform. And I would submit to you, if you can do it in a state like Michigan, why can't we do it in Washington? We need tax reform in Washington at the federal level, because the vast majority of taxes don't come at the state level, they come at the federal level. We need regulatory reform. There's too many regulations handcuffing business to create jobs and job opportunities for you, your brothers, your sisters, your family, your parents, uncles, aunts, etc. We're not creating jobs the way we used to. You know, one of the months in the recovery under Ronald Reagan, and Reagan always pointed out that it's a bipartisan thing. You know, Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill, the Democratic Speaker of the House from Boston, they acted in public like they didn't like each other. But they got along famously. And one of those months during the first couple of years of Reagan's recovery, we created over 1 million jobs. We're celebrating creating a couple 100,000 jobs. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't, but we can do a lot better, and I would submit to you, we'll do a lot better with tax reform and with regulatory reform. So this chart here, what it shows is that Michigan has been one of the top performing states in the Midwest as it relates to income growth. If you look at this slide here, shows that Michigan has led the Great Lakes region and been better than the federal government the last 3 years in GDP growth. If you look at it either as you look at the states themselves on average, or as you look at it from a regional area, Michigan went from being the worst in the Great Lakes, from being the worst performing region in the country to the third, or the fourth or fifth best over the last couple of years. So there's been a tremendous amount of strong economic reform that's taken place in Michigan. That is something to celebrate. Now, another thing that's important to look at in Michigan is the fact that there's starting to be a lot of entrepreneurship. There's a lot of entrepreneurial activity happening in Michigan. And what's important, ladies and gentlemen, is that you understand that Michigan has been the epicenter for entrepreneurship in this country over the last 100 years. When you called, in many foreign papers called the U.S. the arsenal of democracy, many foreign newspapers in England and France pointed out that the epicenter of the arsenal of democracy was Michigan. Because we took those great automobile plants and those steel plants and those chemical plants, and we made airplanes, and we made tanks, and we made rifles, and we made jeeps and armored carriers to turn back the tide of the Nazis and to liberate the world. And it was because we had this great economic engine that we could do these things. And if you look at the great inventions, it's not that the world isn't a wonderful competitive place, because it is. And it's not that entrepreneurship doesn't happen elsewhere, because it does. But the U.S. leads the world still to this day by a fairly hefty margin in patents per capita, in overall patents, and especially commercialized patents. You can patent something, but if you don't make it into something commercially successful. And so you see Michigan is beginning to make an extremely strong comeback as it relates to growth in new business and new business starts. The Kauffman Foundation analyzes every year where states are, where metropolitan regions are, and what you see here is that Michigan has gone from being one of the worst to last year being the 20th best state in terms of economic growth and economic progress. Now, a year or two does not make a trend, but what you're starting to see are some pretty strong correlations. You have tax reform in 2010 with regulatory reform, and a couple of years later you start to see economic growth and you start to see widespread entrepreneurial activity. And one of the things that I think is important for you to note is that if you look at Michigan, even my hometown of Detroit, and I'm not a suburbanite, I grew up in the city, grew up in the Rosedale Park area on the northwest side of the city. I love the city. For a number of years, we've had this seminar in the city of Detroit. Detroit's making a comeback. Detroit's literally been an economic hellhole. Still wonderful people. But when I was a kid, I'm 57 years old, when I was a youngster, the city of Detroit had a population, the city, of over 2 million people. And just recently it dropped below 700,000. Still the same land mass. It's one of the largest cities in the country land mass-wise. But it had dropped to below 700,000 people. But you have people like the Gazzaros family, who goes to Northwood Brad. You know, they've been buying up, and they're the ones that literally were the leaders in refurbishing Greektown 20 years ago. They built the Athenaeum Suites Hotel, Fishbone's restaurant chain, the London Chop House. You look at all the great things Dan Gilbert is doing. And just recently, the second wealthiest man in the world, Carlos Slim, worth about $68 billion from Mexico City, Mexico, started buying real estate in downtown Detroit. Those are all signs that the city had to go through some tough times, and that bankruptcy was not an easy thing. But Slim's looking at a regulatory climate in Michigan. He's looking at a better tax climate. And when a guy like Carlos Slim says, I'm going to start looking at Detroit, I think we all ought to be doing it. And the city of Detroit has been one of the top areas for entrepreneurship. The metro region, including Wayne County, has gone from being number 15 to being number 7. And so when you look at new business starts, new entrepreneurial activity, it's not just the state of Michigan that's doing well. And so, you know, to leave some time for your questions, I'm going to go through these last couple of slides. But this one, Michigan's not a perfect state either. Michigan has problems. And one of Michigan's regulatory problems that we still haven't got a handle on, that we point out in this 180-page study. If you're interested, the study's on our website. It's on the Chamber of Commerce's website. We did the 2012, 2013, and 2014 studies for the Michigan Chamber Foundation. We're working on the 2015 study right now. But Michigan is the second highest cost of auto insurance in the country. We were number 1 for the first 3 years. We dropped to number 2 behind just a smidgen below West Virginia. And this is a problem with a lot of the trial lawyers. Meaning in Michigan, it's one of the few states where you have catastrophic insurance and long-term catastrophic care associated with an auto accident. And all 48 other states do not have that and have dramatically lower cost of automobile insurance than we have in Michigan. If you look at the fact that Michigan is if you look at where we are, the first year we did the study, we had Michigan at 47 out of 50. And I remember when I called Rich Studley, the president of the Michigan Chamber, and he said, well, where are we? In 2012, we were at 47. And he said, can you run the numbers again? I said, Rich, we've run them 14 times. And he says, okay, well, at least we're not 48, 49, or 50. But we were looking at data, ladies and gentlemen, from 2000 to 2012. And we were 47 out of 50. We looked at 200 variables, from tax rates to regulatory rates to cost of insurance, cost of utilities, etc. In 2013, we dropped to 39, so that was an improvement. 1 is the best, 50 is the worst. Last year, we dropped to 30, or improved, moved up to number 30. And what's important is that as you look at these types of pieces of data, you see that it's important to get other points of view or other validations. And what you see here is that Michigan has improved dramatically as it relates to taxes. And it's interesting that competition is a moving target. Indiana is number 10, and they have a lower tax burden. And they became a right-to-work state a year before we did. Interestingly enough, Wisconsin's got a lot of work ahead of itself, but they just earlier this year became the 26th right-to-work state. And what that means is, it's not that you're anti-union. You know, I was a member of the UAW. I'm not an anti-union person, but I'm not a pro-union person. I'm not anti or pro-business. As I said from the beginning, I'm pro-consumer. I want what's best so that the customer can get what he or she wants at a fair price in a free and moral and ethical market. And so when you look at it, it's interesting that Texas is probably the most right-to-work state in the country. Yet headquartered in Texas is Southwest Airlines, the most heavily unionized airlines in the country. And yet, whether you know it or not, Southwest Airlines is the most profitable airline in the United States. And through 9/11, through the financial crisis, Southwest Airlines never once lost money. It's a top 10 place for people to work. So management and labor can get along just famously, even in a right-to-work state like Texas. But what has to happen is, you have to have that environment where management and government and unions form a troika where they work together for what's best for the company and what's best for the consumers. And having a choice to join a union or not, in my opinion, is a good thing. A lot of people will choose to join a union and some won't. But if a union does its job, it shouldn't fear right to work at all. So as you go through and you look, a couple of other variables that we took a look at and we analyzed. We looked at the cities and economic growth of the Great Lakes region cities. And you know what we found is that in the last couple of years, you can validate the study by noting that Detroit did well. Grand Rapids did overall very well. A state like Illinois, not so well. Chicago, not so well. Ohio, pretty good. So the interesting part of it is you should be proud that your alma mater in 2015 will be doing the same study for now also the state of Illinois. The state of Illinois looked at the study. We got a new governor, and we're getting ready to sign the deal probably next week. But we will do the analysis, very competitive analysis for the state of Illinois as well, because Illinois is feeling the pressure. They got Michigan, they got Indiana, and they have Wisconsin. They're all now right-to-work states in the Great Lakes region. And they realize that they have some very difficult issues to deal with. And everybody loves going to the city of Chicago. It's a great city. But Chicago, gang, is in terrible shape financially. Nobody thought Detroit would go bankrupt. Well, those of us that have been paying attention thought it would have happened earlier than it did. I'm telling you right now that Chicago's in a very difficult position financially. So is the state of Illinois. And we have to look at what is the proper size, what is the proper scope of government. This just shows you some of the indices and how well Michigan's done in improving in these indices, from taxes to regulations, etc. And as you can see, Michigan has done well and has proven that it can compete in the policymakers. And again, it's not just a Republican governor and a Republican House and Senate. There's been tremendous cooperation across the aisle, not as much as we'd like, but it's a state that is looking good and moving forward because of sound thinking and because people are debating the questions. If we're not competing, why are we not competing? Why did jobs from 2000 to 2012 dramatically leave Michigan? Why did we lose over 1 million jobs during that period when states like Texas and Florida gained over 1 million jobs? A lot of those jobs they gained were jobs from Michigan because companies left because of a better tax and a better regulatory environment. They didn't go overseas, they went to more business-friendly states. And then last but not least, the thing that I think is important is people think that Michigan is this auto state and that everything is auto-related and that we are strictly an auto-dominated state that, well, thank God the government bailed out Ford and Chrysler and General Motors, or we wouldn't have the economic progress that we've had. Well, things would have been tougher if the government hadn't bailed out Chrysler and General Motors. I'm on record as saying I don't think the government should have, but they did. But I'm also here to tell you that when you look at the companies that didn't get government handouts, that do business across the United States and around the world, look at how well those non-automotive Fortune 500 companies in Michigan have done. Michigan has 19 Fortune 500 companies. 10 of them are auto industry related directly or suppliers indirectly. The other 9 you can see here: Dow Chemical, Whirlpool, Kellogg, Masco. These are all companies that from the trough of the Great Recession to the time we put this chart together for the study late last year, for the 2014 study, these are stocks that have done dramatically well. If you look at the average of those stocks, look at how they outperformed the Dow Jones Industrial Average, the S&P 500, the NASDAQ. Dramatically outperformed those. And so Michigan is becoming a more versatile and diversified state, and Michigan is becoming a state that can compete and that will compete moving forward if it continues to create a more business-friendly environment. So in wrapping up and summarizing my thoughts tonight, ladies and gentlemen, I would first and foremost say to you that, again, I do not believe that the American dream is over. I do not believe that you will, by definition, have a lower standard of living than your parents. That's really the basic definition of the American dream. That your kids have more than you have, that your kids in general are better off than you were. And what I would say to you is that when you look at what it's going to take for the United States to be successful, it's going to take a revisiting by a lot of people to the ideas and ideals that made this country great. As Dale noted, a lot of folks your age do not believe in capitalism. A lot of folks your age do not believe in freedom and free enterprise. And yet you ask them, how do we fund government today? What does government create that it first doesn't take from either households or business? And it's not that we shouldn't have government, and it's not that government isn't important. But the real question is, maybe the problems that we have today, moving forward, are due to the fact that there's less freedom, and there's less free enterprise, and there's less capitalism today than there was 10 or 15 years ago. And you hear all the time from people, well, Dr. Nash, what about the banking crisis? Wasn't that a failure of capitalism? Absolutely not. The banking crisis, you ever ask yourself the question, why hasn't any major bank figure gone to jail? You say, because, well, I don't know, that's a good question. And they haven't gone to jail because something called Glass-Steagall, under President Clinton, with support from a Democratic and a Republican House of Representatives and Senate, deregulated banking and allowed banks to be a lot more risky, yet it continued to increase the deposit insurance on banks. Now, I would prefer a much more free market insurance system for banks. like we have for most other areas of business. But if you're not going to have that, then the government and the Federal Reserve and the Congress has to regulate banks and can't just turn around and deregulate banks and then say, well, gee, we didn't quite see some of these risks taking place. A lot of the risks that banks took, were they silly? Yes. Might you call them stupid? Yes. But quite frankly, they were legal because we did away with that regulation when we dramatically reduced the effect of Glass-Steagall without any type of replacement. Or you ask yourself the question, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, who started those two organizations? The federal government did. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac lost billions and billions of dollars and were part of the major cornerstone of the banking crisis. And so, when one takes a look at it, what I would simply suggest to you is ask yourself the question, why is this the greatest economy in the history of the world? At the epicenter, it's good, moral, ethical people competing in an incredibly free and dynamic market that has taken us from horses and buggies to the moon, that has taken us from crank phones to cell phones, that has dramatically improved the standard of living, that in 1900 the average American lived 46 years, and today the average American lives over 85 years. We can do better, but we should not lose our roots as to the greatness of this country and a big chunk of the world today. So I suggest to you that you question what you hear, that if you don't like it, disagree. Do it with respect, but disagree over the next 3 days and throughout the rest of your academic career. But also keep an open ear and an open eye and an open mind to the differences and the success of the United States and Canada, much of Europe, and the positive changes taking place in Asia. These are all good things being driven by what I would describe as freedom and free enterprise. And it's the reason why we have this seminar. So with that, I would simply say to you, thank you for being here. And I think I have about 10 or 15 minutes. We'd love to handle any questions that you have. We'll finish when we're done with the questions. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for having me. Questions? Yes? No?
Ray, earlier you said that Chicago was in a bad financial state.
Yes.
Can you elaborate a little bit more on that? Because I'm from Chicago and I'm not home a lot, so I don't really know too much about it. So
Yeah, if you look at Chicago, and by the way, it's one of my favorite places to go. My wife and I were never more pleased when our son was, between his junior and senior year, lived in Lincoln Park and worked for Bank of America for a summer internship. It's a great town. It's an incredibly, as you know, diverse town. But it is a town that, if you look at the problems in the city of Detroit, what caused the problems in the city of Detroit? What do you think? Why did the city of Detroit go bankrupt?
Corruption.
Corruption was part of it. Part of it was ignorance as to financial planning. Part of it was as businesses left and revenue declined relative to government spending, you had more and more deficits. Part of it was as you looked at things like funding of pensions. You talk about your police pension, your fire department pension, your city workers pension. We kept putting IOUs into those funds, and we kept saying that we would, the next year when things get better, we'll pay next year's burden, and then we will make up for the difference. And we never did. And Chicago, unfortunately, is in the same place. Pension funds for city workers, government employees, police, fire department, they're all dramatically underfunded, and you have a growing city debt, in terms of bond debt that you owe, that just is if you think about the current operation and future projected operation, it's just not something that is any kind of a sound fiscal extrapolation will tell you that it's not going to be funded. And so I would simply say to you that the real question, like the case with Michigan, when they finally decided to deal with something in Michigan, we had a lot of cases where finally the state government said, enough's enough. We'll bail out part of the city of Detroit, but we're going to have to say that, look, we can't kid ourselves. We can't pay pensions. There's not enough money coming in to pay the current obligation to city workers, firemen, and policemen that are retiring. And so what we had to do was we had to recalibrate the pensions. We had to declare bankruptcy. And then, those folks took a haircut, as they call it. They lost about 25% of their pension. Had it not gone to bankruptcy, you never could have done that, and you never would have got people to agree to it. But literally, that's what's happened in Detroit, and my estimate is that Chicago's in a worse position than Detroit. So that's what I mean by heading toward bankruptcy. There's not enough money coming in to what the city is spending.
Thank you.
No, you're welcome.
Good afternoon.
Yes, sir.
This is not necessarily related to the presentation, but since you are an economist, the unemployment numbers came out last week, and economists expected that the number of jobs that we had in April or March would be 250,000, so they came out dramatically lower at about 120,000 jobs. So could you give a possible rationale for why that occurred?
What I would say, David, is that, and by the way, David, young Mr. Valentine helps us out with our monthly economic outlook. The real difficulty is, and I hate to say this, the U.S. economy is not doing well. We're not growing the way we should, and it's funny. Oh, I can't think of her name right now. Sheila. I get this call from a reporter from the New York Times because every year the piece that Keith Brady and I do on the forecast usually is pretty darn good, and so we'll get the calls and they'll ask us what do we think about this. The New York Times hasn't quoted us yet, but they think that we've done a pretty good job. Her first name is Sheila. I can't think of her last name. But again, she called and asked where I thought the economy was going about a month ago, and I said, I think that the U.S. economy is going to grow at 2.5, 2.6. That's what our president and I put in writing. It's pretty accurate. She said, yeah, I see that. I look at it. I said, well, why don't you have it quoted? She goes, well, I don't think you're right. And I said, well, that's the problem with the old ostrich in the desert, the proverbial lion. So we said that the economy is not going to do well, and contrary to what a lot of people were saying, most economists thought that the first quarter originally was going to grow at 2.3%. Then others thought it was going to grow at 1.9%. And you've got a great economist tomorrow, Paul Traub from the Detroit branch of the Chicago Fed. Ask Paul that question as well. But the now preliminary data shows that GDP for the first quarter is somewhere between 0.1 and 0% growth. And I just think that it is speaking to the fact of two things, David. Number one, 125,000 jobs or 129,000 jobs, wherever it was, is not good at all. A capitalist economy has to create, like the U.S., has to create between 225,000 and 250,000 jobs just to stay even. And the thing I worry about is we're accepting mediocrity as the new normal. Yes, did we have a good year for job growth last year? Yes, but by historic standards, it wasn't good. It was good for the last 5 or 6 years, but if you go back and look at the 90s or the 80s, it was not a good year for job growth. And remember, that was job growth in terms of sheer numbers when there were many fewer people employed in the 80s and the 90s than there are today. Our job market, our number of people employed is a lot bigger today. So 200,000 in today's market is nowhere near 200,000 jobs created in a month in the mid-1980s or the mid-1990s. And again, some people accuse me of not liking President Obama. It's absolutely not true. I'd love to meet President Obama. I'd love to have a beer with him. I would agree not to talk politics with him. I think he's a fascinating human being. He strikes me as being a great husband, a great, I won't say great wife, it strikes me as being a great father. He has 2 beautiful daughters. I just disagree with his politics. I just don't think that the economics, I wouldn't even say I disagree with his politics. So his politics sector, I disagree with his economics. He constantly is arguing an anti-business mentality. And I happen to believe that the cornerstone of this country is business. And what made this country great is business. And when my Irish grandfather came over from Ireland, my Polish grandfather came over at age 13 from Ostrowiecka, Poland, and they had nothing. They had a dime on his back. My grandfather hated one of my best friends still to this day. One of my best friends that grew up in Detroit, his name is Dennis Deponio. And Dennis's uncle was also a Deponio, not because there was interbreeding, but because they all came from the Deponio region of Italy, and they had the last name Deponio, and so his mom was a Deponio, his dad was a Deponio. And his uncle owned the largest construction company in Michigan, one of the largest in the Midwest, Greenfield Construction, Michigan Sewer, Angelo Deponio Equipment. He built the foundation for the Renaissance Center. He built most of I-275 in Detroit. He built the tunnels in Flint for different types of sewage and drainage movement. And I worked for Mr. Deponio when we were in high school. And this guy, Dennis is my best friend. Dennis married my wife's roommate. So we're kind of related, actually, now today. And my grandfather, whenever I would bring Dennis over to see my grandfather, and my grandfather died at age 83. He was incredibly lucid until he was 80. And then he had 7 mini strokes and he died when he was 83. And he smoked Camel no filters most of his life. He was a foreman at a Chrysler plant in Detroit. And he hated Italians. Why do you think my grandfather hated Italians? You want to know? Ask me. Nash, why did your grandfather hate Italians? Because that's a great question. When my grandfather got off the boat at Ellis Island, didn't speak a lick of English. He was 13 years old. His family had lost everything. His family had a very large farm in northern Poland. The Russians had occupied northern Poland. So the only people he hated more than Italians were Russians. So the family went from having a pretty good life to not having much of a life, and they were sending their eldest son to experience the American dream. So his boat gets getting close. He sees the Statue of Liberty. His mom had told him about Ellis Island and the Statue of Liberty. He puts his suit on. He's got one nice suit. And he's going to go in and interview for jobs, etc. He's walking down the gangplank from the boat to the call it check-in station. I'm not sure the technical name. There were a bunch of Italians standing up over the bridge. What do you think those Italians were doing every now and then? You will not find this to be very sanitary or endearing. No, they didn't spit. It was worse than that. They stood up and sprinkled yellow liquid over all the coals coming off the boat. So my grandfather goes through line. He's inside this hot Ellis Island, and he stinks along with all the other people around him. And he's trying to get a job, and for days he's going in and they're kicking him out of the business. And he doesn't speak much English, and he smells like you know what. And he went west. And he first went to Milwaukee, and then he settled in Detroit, and the rest is history. But I remember saying to my grandfather, I said, Papa, I said, Dennis is one of my best friends. And he just didn't want to see him. I said, Grandpa, I have a job with Dennis's uncle. Didn't want to hear it. And then finally one time I said, Grandpa, I can't come to see you because I don't have a car. Dennis has a car. And I said, and if Dennis doesn't come, I can't visit you anymore. And then finally he asked Dennis to come over, kissed him on the cheek. And there was at least one Italian my grandfather liked before he died. But the thing that I think is important is that we forget about what made this country great. There was no social welfare when my grandfather came to the United States, and hell, he wouldn't have been allowed in at age 13 today. But he graduated from high school. He had a great job. He had 4 wonderful daughters, one of them being my mom. And, we forget about, the history and the traditions that made this country great. And if you look at it, there's so many great things about this country. And, if you look at, you ought to read, if you haven't, read the works of people like Walter Williams or Thomas Sowell. These happen to be 2 very famous black economists that talk about how, if you look at the 1940s and the early 1950s, unemployment among African American teenagers was lower than whites. Interesting. Out of wedlock births were lower among African American teenagers than whites, and both were a lot lower than it is today. Divorce rates were lower among African Americans than whites. Harlem was the most rapidly growing center of entrepreneurship in the entire state of New York, one of the #1 places in the U.S. And oftentimes a lot of these government programs designed to help people don't help people at all. And so what I would simply suggest is, I believe that this is the greatest economy in the history of the world, because with all of our inequities, with all of our, inadequacies, with the mistakes we've made, we still have the most diverse, the most rapidly expanding economy in terms of size, scope, depth, and breadth of people in business. And now what we've got to do is get the economic engine rolling more rapidly or performing at a higher pace so that we can create better jobs and better incomes for all. But again, the strength of this country, gang, is the fact that we're black, we're white, we're Asian, we're Catholic, we're Protestant, we're Jewish, we're Muslim, we're Hindu, we're Shinto, we're atheists, we're agnostics. We're everything. But what we have in common is this belief in a free country. And sometimes we get confused as to what caused its greatness. But I would suggest to you, those that think more government's the answer, look at Europe. Europe's got a lot more government than we do, and it's an economic basket case. I have a wonderful Dutch son-in-law who's living here because his family has 6 Ford dealerships, and he thinks it's better to start out on his own here than go work in the family business in Europe. If you have any more questions, come on up. Thank you very, very much. Have a great rest of the week.